Hey everybody, today I want to talk about some new records that I just listed to my website, needlemeetsvinyl.com, and let's just get right into it. The very first record I want to talk about happens to be one of my all-time favorite records. Now I know I say this a lot, I talk a lot about my all-time favorite record or my favorite record by an artist, but this is truly a record that when I heard it for the first time, it just changed my life and it introduced me to this artist, and I have been obsessed with him ever since. Happens to be this album by Harry Nilsson, and this is an album called Aerial Pandemonium Ballet. Now, this is kind of an interesting record in the sense that it's considered the very first remix album. So what it is it's Nilsson put out his first two records he put out on RCA were an album called Pandemonium Shadow Show, which is his first one, that's pictured right there. And then the second one he put out was called Aerial Ballet, which is right there. And then after those albums, he released an album called Harry, and then he released an album called The Point. And in the meantime, he also had a hit single with a song called Everybody's Talkin'. So he was becoming more and more popular. And so in 1971, RCA wanted to re-release these first two albums of his because Nilsson was so popular, and so there was a demand for those early albums. But Nilsson was an artist that always he just went his own way. He never really listened to what anyone else wanted. He had a lot of hits, but he never really repeated any of those hit formulas. He would always do something new. So when they wanted him to re-release these first two albums, what he did was he went back into the studio and remixed a lot of those songs, and even added new vocal parts to certain songs, took away certain vocal parts, and just generally made, in my opinion, all the songs sound a lot better. And so that is what this album is. It's a mixture of the songs from his first and second albums on RCA put into this new album called Aerial Pandemonium Ballet. Now, I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but really, it sounds amazing. This is an amazing collection of songs, and in my opinion, this is like a best of Harry Nilsson's early years. It's so melodic. These, by the way, are the two albums that the Beatles first heard. So famously, the Beatles, when John and Paul came over to America in 1968 to announce the formation of Apple Records, they had a press conference in New York, and during that press conference, they were asked, who's your favorite, they said group, but who's your favorite artist of the time? And John Lennon said Nilsson. They asked Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney also said Nilsson. So Nilsson got an amazing endorsement early on in his career from the Beatles. So, and the two albums that they heard that really blew them away were these first two albums by Harry. So anyway, that's that's a lot of a backstory on this Nilsson album. But the first time I ever heard this, I heard this on CD actually. It was the very first band I ever joined that wasn't like a bunch of guys from my high school. It was a band of these a lot older guys. I was like 19, they were all in their mid-20s, so they weren't that much older, but older guys to me. And one of them had this CD in their car, and they were playing it, and I was just blown away. I didn't know who the artist was. I knew it sounded kind of like the Beatles, kind of like the Beach Boys, but I loved all the harmony vocals. I loved all the actual songs themselves. The melodies were just amazing. And my friend then told me it was Harry Nilsson, and I immediately went out and got that CD, and I listened to it over and over again. And to this day, I have not stopped listening to this album. And this pressing happens to be an amazing sounding pressing. This is on the RCA label, and it just sounds fantastic. And if you've never heard Harry Nilsson's early work, this is the way to do it. This is the way to get into Nilsson. Or if you know someone that you really want to get into Nilsson, this is the album to do it, in my opinion. So definitely go on the website, check this one out, because I cannot praise it enough. It's so fantastic. Harry Nilsson, Aerial Pandemonium Ballet. Check that one out for sure. Okay, moving on. I've been posting a lot of Rolling Stones records because I made it a point about maybe like 2 months ago. I really wanted to get a lot of Rolling Stones albums on the website because the first, obviously, artist that I really tried to tackle was the Beatles. And by the way, there are more Beatle records coming. In fact, this week I will be posting some amazing Beatle pressings. So just hold tight there. The Beatles are coming. But after I worked on that big wave of the Beatles, I started tackling the Rolling Stones. And I've now listed, in my opinion, almost all of the albums that are essential when it comes to the Rolling Stones. And this happens to be one of the last ones that I will be having on the website. This is an album by the Rolling Stones called Emotional Rescue. Now, this might be an odd choice for some of you out there going, why is he talking about Emotional Rescue? There's a reason for that. In my opinion, this is one of the most overlooked Rolling Stones albums. Now, first of all, there's something really amazing about this album that only it can say is true for all Rolling Stones albums. This album sounds absolutely amazing. I don't know what the heck was going on during these sessions, but this record sounds really good. I will go as far as to say that I think this might be one of the best sounding Rolling Stones albums of the 1970s, or actually I guess this is released in 1980, but of that decade, that second decade of the Rolling Stones. It just sounds really, really good. Another album that sounds really good about the Rolling Stones is Black and Blue, also a very high quality sounding album, but this one just sounds so great. It's a really, really excellent sounding record, and it has a lot of songs on here that I think are really overlooked, and they're really, really excellent Rolling Stones songs. It happens to be on the Rolling Stones' very own Rolling Stones Records label, and it also has Sterling on both sides, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, when Sterling is stamped on either side of the record, and when it's on both sides, like this record, it almost always sounds fantastic because, you know, that stamp is just an approval that says this record was made with care and mastered with care, and it's just going to sound really good. Like I said, not always the truth, but most of the time that is the truth. And this one sounds very, very excellent. And this song just has a lot of songs that are not typical Stones songs that you would think about when you think about the Stones from the 70s or the 80s. And just an album that's worth owning, in my opinion. And one of the Stones albums that, by the way, sometimes when I have some friends come over and they want to listen to records, and they'll say, like, oh, put on a Rolling Stones record, or put on a record that I've never heard that will impress me. A lot of times I will put Emotional Rescue on and try to have them guess what band it is. Kind of a fun game to do. And by the way, everyone's always impressed with this album. Always. So check that one out on the website. Moving on. This is an album by Fleetwood Mac. And this happens to be an album by Fleetwood Mac that is the very first album that features Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. So, of course, I'm sure a lot of you know, Fleetwood Mac went through a bunch of lineup changes. They started out as a British blues band, and then they kind of morphed into like a British rock/pop kind of blues band for a while there. And then eventually they settled upon their most famous lineup with Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks added to the lineup. And then they became just a straight-on rock/pop band. Well, this is the first album they made with Lindsey and Stevie in the band, and it's just an excellent, excellent album. It has a ton of hit songs on here, including Rhiannon, Say You Love Me by Christine McVie, Landslide by Stevie Nicks, Monday Morning by Lindsey Buckingham. It's just packed full of hits. And I went through a bunch of different pressings of this album to come upon this very one. I can guarantee you that this one sounds absolutely phenomenal. I think I went through at least 10, possibly closer to like 12 to like 14 copies of this record to hit upon this very one. Now this one has Ken Dunn stamped onto both sides, which is a very, very good thing. And it's on the original Reprise label. It also has Pogo with a heart symbol etched into both sides as well. Now, these are very early pressings of this album, and they sound absolutely great. And the best part about these records is the bass sound. Now, John McVie, the bass player of Fleetwood Mac, is just one of the most underrated bass players of all time. And it's obviously very, very important to get a pressing that has great low end so you can really appreciate his bass lines, because his bass lines on this album are amazing. They're just moving all over the place, very melodic, and pretty much John McVie and Mick Fleetwood were the best rhythm section, one of the best rhythm sections in rock and roll of all time. Such solid grooves. This is just an excellent record that anyone that cares about rock music or likes Fleetwood Mac would like to have in their record collection, because it's just an essential album. So check this one out for sure. Okay, moving on. Now, this is an album that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. I'm sure there are a lot of you out there who have seen this album cover before but don't know much about this record. Now, I was one of those people about 2 years ago. I had always seen this album cover. By the way, this is by a band called King Crimson. I'd always seen this. I knew it was by King Crimson, but I'd never heard it. I knew it was like prog rock. It was like an early prog rock record. But I finally, like I said, about 2 years ago, picked up a copy for myself. I got a British copy, a later British pressing of it. And I really started to really kind of like the record. I really appreciated it for what it was. Now, I have to admit, I'm not a prog rock fan at all. That's not a genre that I'm really that much into. But I really appreciate anything that is recorded well or is just an artistic statement that the people who worked on it really put a lot of time and effort into it. And I just love records. So anytime there's a classic record that I don't know, I like to try to educate myself on it. And this was one of those. Now, I went through a bunch of different pressings to try to get one of these for the website, because I will say this, I wasn't going to have this on my website, but I've had more than I think I've had at least 3 or 4 people send me messages asking when I'm going to have this on the website. So I made it a point to try to get it, and here it is. I went through about 6 different pressings of this, and this happens to be a UK pressing, and it's on the Island label, and it's a later Island label, but this sounds really, really good, and it's a really, really clean copy. Finding clean copies of this album are just really hard. Finding this album at all, by the way, finding original pressings of this album, not the reissues, it's like a needle in a haystack type thing. It's just such a popular record that most people really, really want this. Now, I have in my own personal collection, like I said, I have a UK pressing of this that I used to match against this one, and this one sounds better than the one that I have. And normally, I would not stand for that. I would want to have the best sounding pressing for my own collection. But to be perfectly honest with you, like I said, this isn't really my type of album. I'm not really into prog rock. But so I'm happy with the copy that I have in my collection right now. But I know there are people out there that really, really want this record, and they want it to sound really, really good. And this is exactly that pressing for you. So if you're in the market for this King Crimson album, In the Court of the Crimson King, and by the way, this is their debut album, then this is the pressing for you. Now, one thing about this album that I found very interesting is that the band, when they recorded this album, they recorded it onto an 8-track tape machine, which is very common in the late 60s. In 1969, I believe, is when they started recording this. Very common. So they recorded to the 8-track. But then they had another 8-track machine so that they would bounce all of their songs in between those 2 machines. So they would fill up all 8 tracks on the first machine and then transfer all of those down to 2 tracks on the next machine to have 6 more tracks available, and they would do that over and over and over again. Well, the more you do that, the more you lose sound quality when it comes to the tapes. So there are certain songs on here that do kind of have the highs are a little bit thin, and so a lot of pressings tend to sound really, really bad for certain songs with this album. This pressing, fortunately, doesn't have that problem at all. All the songs that normally sound bad on the bad pressings on here sound really, really good. So this is a very, very special pressing of this King Crimson album. So definitely check it out on the website. Worth checking out for sure. And by the way, all these records, of course, would make fantastic Christmas gifts or Hanukkah gifts or holiday gifts for anyone that you know who likes to collect records. Maybe that person happens to be you. So don't forget to buy something for yourself this Christmas. I know I'll be doing that for me. I bought myself the Beatles singles collection box set, as I'm sure a lot of you know. Okay, every once in a while I got to be a salesman, right? Moving on. This is an album by The Who. This is an album by The Who called The Who Live at Leeds. Now, this has the distinction of being considered by many people to be one of the best live albums ever released by anyone. It also has the distinction of being the only Who live album that was released while all four original members were still alive and were still active in the band. So this is the only record with Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, Keith Moon, and John Entwistle. I think I said all four of them, right? That was released while they were all still a band. Now, this happens to be a pressing from Holland, and it just sounds so good. I had a bunch of different pressings of this. I had US pressings, I had UK pressings, but this pressing from Holland just had something a little bit extra, a little bit more magical about it. As you can see, it's on the Polydor label. This record is in beautiful, beautiful shape. And it's just a very powerful record is the best way I could describe it. As soon as you put the needle on, this thing gets going and it will throw you back in your seat. The drums, the bass, the guitars are just absolutely electric and on fire. And it's just such a fun record to listen to. And the songs on here are a lot of songs that The Who didn't put out on any of their official studio albums. A lot of cool covers. They do Summertime Blues. They do Young Man Blues. And then the songs that they did release on some of their albums are a lot of their earlier songs like Substitute, Magic Bus, My Generation. By the way, My Generation on here is 14 minutes and 27 seconds, and it's such a cool jam. So this is just an absolutely classic album that I think everyone should have in their collection, and this pressing is just on fire. So check out this album by The Who, Live at Leeds. Very, very, very cool one. And last but not least, this is a record that I have been wanting to put on my website for a very long time. It's a personal favorite of mine. It may not be a lot of favorites of other people's, and it may not even ever sell on my website. I don't care. It deserves mention. I think it's a very, very good album. This is George Harrison's album, Somewhere in England. This one happens to have the original hype sticker still on there, and the hype sticker says, contains the hit song All Those Years Ago. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the anniversary of John Lennon's tragic passing was a couple of days ago on December 8th. And in 1980, when that terrible event happened, George Harrison did what Paul McCartney also did. He went right into the studio and started working on music, and that was his way of dealing with the grief. And the song he began working on was a song that he originally had written for Ringo to play on and to record with different lyrics. But after what happened to John happened, George rewrote the lyrics and used the song for himself as a tribute to John Lennon. And he eventually got Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney, and Denny Lane to sing backing vocals on the song, and Ringo plays drums, so it's a mini Beatles reunion. Also, George Martin and Jeff Emmerich from the Beatles production team, George Martin being the producer, Jeff Emmerich being the engineer, also worked on the song. So it's just a very excellent song. If you haven't heard it, you should listen to it. It's really, really good. Besides it being a fantastic tribute to John Lennon, it's just a good song. It just sounds good. It's got that typical George Harrison, excellent production, great chords, all that great stuff. Now, the one thing I will say, though, is I think that song has kind of tainted this album, because I think a lot of people just think about this album as, oh, it has All Those Years Ago. It even has the hype sticker on here saying contains All Those Years Ago. And while that's fantastic because it's a great song, the other songs in this album are also really good. They're all kind of like these moody, kind of haunting songs. And in my opinion, some of George's most overlooked songs of his solo career. There's a song on here called Blood from a Clone, which just happens to be the first song on here, which is such an amazing George song. It's such a biting, just beautiful, beautiful George Harrison song that really makes a great statement about the music industry at the time and how George felt about it. Because originally this album, by the way, was a lot different. George, he was having troubles with his record label, Warner Brothers. He submitted his original album called Somewhere in England to them. They didn't like it. They said it needed to have more hits on it. So instead of adding more hits to the album, George wrote a song called Blood from a Clone, which is basically saying that they wanted him to just churn out fake material hits, and he wouldn't do it. So he wrote a song called Blood from a Clone about that, which is on the album. Although what's kind of funny is eventually George did have a hit that was included on the album all those years ago. By the way, it was I think it was number 2 in the US, and it was number 13 in the UK. So it was definitely a hit song, and it helped propel the album to be a kind of a hit album as well. But it's just got a bunch of really, really cool songs. And the cool thing about the Beatles and the Beatles solo careers is that there are some albums that are still out there that a lot of people who are Beatle fans haven't heard some of the Beatles solo records. And I think this is one of them. A lot of times people will say to me I've heard All Things Must Pass, I love it, I've heard Brainwashed, I've heard Cloud 9, what's the next George Harrison album I should buy? And I always point him in the direction of 33 1/3, which is an amazing record, and I also point him in the direction of this album, Somewhere in England, just because to me it's so fun to listen to a record that you've never heard before by an artist that you know you love. And so this is one of those records by George, and this is on his original Dark Horse label. And this is just by the way, I just talked about how great the songs are. It's also an excellent sounding pressing. I went through numerous copies of this. They're pretty easy to find in the record stores, but finding one that sounds phenomenal is kind of a little bit of a difficult task, just for I don't know really the number one reason. Probably just has to do a lot with quality control as far as how the records were made. A lot of these that I found, a lot of the very first tracks, like the first track on side 1 and on side 2, tended to be a little bit noisy and were kind of cut weird. This one is not. This one is absolutely perfect in every single way. So check this one out if you have not given this one a chance. It's worth doing. I have it, by the way, on the website for a very, very reasonable price. All these records, by the way, on the website are all listed for a very reasonable price. So check it out. Go to needlemeetsvinyl.com. Look at this George Harrison record. Check out this Who record, Live at Leeds. This King Crimson record. This Fleetwood Mac record. This Rolling Stones record. And last but not least, a record that is so dear to my heart, Harry Nilsson's Aerial Pandemonium Ballet. These are all excellent, excellent records that I think you will really enjoy. So head on over to needlemeetsvinyl.com. You know the deal, right? I always talk about go to the website, the whole thing, and head on over there, because I think there's some records in there that you will really, really like. And also, if you don't want to buy them, that's okay. You don't got to buy them. You could just go on the website and you can read all about these records, because I list a lot of back information on how the record was recorded, where it was recorded, who was producing it, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in learning more about these records, you can also go to the website and do that. So that's it for now, and we'll talk to you later. Okay, stay tuned for Beatle records. They're coming. Okay, bye for now.